Katerina Jakob watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Jakob saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for November 9th, or is it November 10th? I think I've got my dates all wrong here. It's well, whatever it is, for November 11th. That's what it is. Geez, I've got this written down wrong. For November 11th. 2021. Anyway, first up on our list, COP-26 allows American empire and its allies to exhibit a climate farce while undermining the environment behind the scenes. This COP-26 is the 26th version. It's the it's when nations from all over the world get together to discuss global warming, climate crisis, and so forth. It happens right after the G20 summit. Anyway, just before, and this what I'm going to read you here is comes from 4 different articles from various publications, and so let me just start out. Just before Biden left for the G20 summit, his meeting with Pope Francis and the COP-26, he had his administration pressure the oil-producing states, OPEC Plus, to do the needful when it comes to supply. That was a direct quote from Biden. To do the needful when it comes to supply, namely to increase oil production. While the U.S. pressured OPEC Plus to boost oil production, the UN Environment Program released its key report on global emissions. UNEP pointed out that the G20 countries account for close to 80% of global greenhouse gases, and that the three highest per capita major carbon emitters are Saudi Arabia, Australia, and the United States. Before the Glasgow meeting, the G20 leaders convened in Rome to firm up their own approach towards the climate catastrophe. The communique that emerged from that meeting, G20 Rome leaders declaration, was tepid, using terms like make progress, strengthen actions, and scale up. According to the report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, unless carbon emissions are reduced, it is unlikely that the key goal of having no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming compared to pre-industrial levels will be met. It ain't gonna happen, in other words, as long as we've got the G20 in charge. At the United Nations in September, China's president, Xi Jinping, said China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. He also stated that China will not build new coal-fired plants overseas. This was a monumental statement, far ahead of any of the pledges made by the other major global powers. Rather than build on this commitment, the debate driven by the West has largely been to malign developing countries, including China, and blame them for the climate catastrophe. John Ross, who is a British academic and works at universities in London and in Beijing, said China's per capita CO2 emissions are only 46% of the US emissions, while other developing countries emit even less. A coalition of watchdog groups estimated Monday that fossil fuel industry representatives have a larger presence at the COP-26 than officials from any single country. A finding that further intensified environmentalists' concerns about the legitimacy of high-stakes climate summit. Glasgow, the host city of the COP26 summit, has been witnessing protests with demands for radical change to tackle the global climate catastrophe over the past week. On Saturday, November 6th, the city saw more than 100,000 people, as per reports, marching through the streets despite heavy rain and extreme weather. The protesters at the Glasgow March represented various groups, including indigenous organizations, frontline communities, trade unions, youth groups, peace and anti-war groups, communist and left organizations, and different environmental organizations. Despite a broad spectrum of platforms, the protesters were united around the recognition that without system change, there is no way to take the urgent necessary measures to save the planet and advance climate justice. The first draft of the Glasgow final decision text, which it was leaked this past Monday, at the COP26 completely fails to mention fossil fuels, despite expert consensus on the need to end new coal, oil, and gas immediately to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees centigrade. Thanks to blocking by fossil fuel interests, the first version of the official text published by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change fails to acknowledge that fossil fuels are driving the climate crisis, nor does it make any commitment to tangible actions to end the global reliance on coal, oil, and gas. The text is just under 550 words long. So what are your thoughts, Rainer?
My thoughts are, there's two sides to the climate story right now. On the one hand, you have these imperialist countries that are deliberately neglecting the need to reduce emissions. On the other, you have the PRC, as well as the few countries that have the resources and political will to substantially impact the climate in the kind of positive way the PRC is doing. It's like, say, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, and so on. These countries are taking the opposite approach. And obviously, without them, without China in particular, our situation would likely be a lot more dire. Humanity would be a lot more likely, I think, to ultimately go extinct. And the climate apocalyptic thinkers would have more of a point. So that's something that we need to recognize when it comes to China, that everybody needs to recognize when it comes to China, that they're essentially our saviors when it comes to climate. But this saving can only go so far because their reach is still quite limited. The US military is still the largest institutional producer of petroleum on the planet. And the majority of the world is not on board, or the majority of the world is not yet able to be impacted by the socialist agenda of the PRC, which is the only agenda that's really compatible with the idea of properly mitigating global warming. So I think there's nuances all throughout this. It's not going to be either a total save for the planet nor a total collapse. There's going to be degrees of collapse. There's going to be degrees of humanitarian crises. And I think in the coming decades, we're going to see even more of a contrast between how the PRC handles the world's catastrophes and how countries like the United States handle catastrophes. In these last couple of years, we've certainly seen that with the pandemic, which China has pretty much recovered from, whereas the US has been impacted with, I think, by far the most deaths out of any country, despite being, well, I'm pretty sure it's still the richest country and it's technically still the most powerful country, yet it's had by far the most COVID-19 deaths. That's an omen.
Yeah, it is the richest country and it is the most powerful country. No maybes about that. But
it's hard to believe.
It is on decline.
Yeah, these things are hard to believe anymore with what's happened, especially in these last couple of years.
Yeah, well, the bigger they come, the harder they fall, and it's a long way down from the height that the American empire reached in the beginning 2 or 3 decades of the post-war period. Anyway, is this the end of the unreformable Democratic Party, asks Michael Hudson. Michael Hudson is a well-known American Marxist economist and academic. Anyway, in this article, he says a Wall Street Journal editorial on November 4th spun its view of what is at stake for the Democratic Party. They said, with quotes here, voters warned Democrats to walk away from Sanders' Pelosi agenda. The Democrats' own leadership quickly agreed with this take, playing the blame game against the Progressive Caucus for insisting on economic reforms that opinion polls have reported are precisely what voters say they want. So that's the Wall Street Journal's look at it. 80% of the Democrats want this, so you better take that because we're going to lose donors if you don't, or if you do. But these are not the policies that the party's major donors want. What really is at issue is just whom the Democratic Party and their duopoly partners, the Republicans too, of course, supports. Corporate lobbyists, the donor class, or wage-earning voters seeking economic policies that benefit them as employees, consumers, and debtors. Can there really be doubt as to what is causing the apathy of voters to support the Clintonite Virginia candidate Terry McAuliffe? Was his loss really because voters opposed Sanders in the Congressional Progressive Caucus as radical extremists for supporting the policy platform that President Biden himself ran on and which got Democrats elected? Was it that Democrats are not sufficiently supporting their Wall Street and corporate donors and lobbyists, and that somehow voting for McAuliffe might empower Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the squad? Democrats calling themselves centrist or moderate insist that progressives surrender to the Manchin cinema rewrite of the original version of the Build Back Better Act and make it into a grab bag benefiting the 5% instead of the 95% by replacing its most popular proposals with giveaways to the wealthy, as if this will win elections, or at least win campaign financing for the party. In today's U.S. political duopoly, the role of the Democrat Party is to protect the Republicans from attacks from the left. What the Republicans and centrists want is a hard business infrastructure program, not its pro-labor elements. President Biden is blaming progressives for blocking the program by trying to preserve the policies that most voters actually want, and which he himself ran on in his presidential campaign a year ago. Put bluntly, is the Democratic Party an agent of democracy or oligarchy? The past month's congressional debacle confirms Aristotle's description of democracy. Many states have constitutions that are democratic in form, he wrote, but actually are oligarchies. So this article, that was just some highlights from the article. There's a lot more to it. Basically, Hudson is getting to the point that something in the neighborhood of 80% of Democrats are progressive, pro-left, socialist, so forth. And then there's the 20% that actually support the Democrat leadership, and the leadership is neoliberal, anti-labor, anti-worker, certainly anti-socialist. Like Hillary Clinton said, I'm not a socialist and I would never be. So the Democrat Party has a kind of a quandary, but it's a quandary that will be there as long as there is a Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is designed from the get-go to be controlled by the capitalist ruling class, not by its own members. It's controlled specifically, so it's designed specifically so that its own members do not have any real power within the party. So that's why you get this kind of really weird situation where 80% of the party want a specific program, and yet the party leadership and the party's caucus in Congress are opposed to that program. So what are your thoughts, Rainer?
Lenin said that the masses aren't going to be ready to participate in a revolution until after they've gained the sufficient amount of political experience, meaning until after they've been betrayed over and over again by the people within the system who claim to be able to save them from their ever worsening conditions under capitalism, but who just keep pulling the rug out from under them. I mean, a lot of people, I feel, have undergone this process in these last 5 years with Bernie Sanders, after Sanders flip-flopped and endorsed Clinton and deprived his working class supporters of their chances for a raised minimum wage, Medicare for all, stuff like that. A lot of those working class people decided to jump ship from the Democratic Party, and a certain amount of them, I'm not saying all, I'm not saying most, but some of them became Marxist-Leninists. That's been the case for me. That's been the case for some people who I know personally, and that's all that matters. I feel I should be satisfied with that victory, because we're going to have a lot more victories like that, and we're going to be able to keep building up our revolutionary Marxist-Leninist cadres due to the fact that the Democratic Party, including the so-called progressives, are going to keep betraying the people over and over again.
Yeah, a poll from last year, and this was a right-wing poll, so it's not what they wanted to see. But a poll last year found that 1/3 of youth in the United States say that they're communist now. And more than 1/2 say that they're socialist. So those are the people you're talking about. The people, most of the people who say that they're socialist are either communist or social democrat, and the people who say that they're socialist and are not communist are usually social democrats. So you know, it's we're witnessing a rather grand radicalization over the last 10-year period, over the last little more than 10 years now. And it's still got a way to go before a majority are communists, but just the fact that 1/3 of them are communists is very substantial. So it's an extraordinary change for the United States. Next on the list, how imperialist propaganda weaponizes genocide to justify war. Rainer Shea.
I watched this documentary called The Zionist Story. It's made by a Jewish man who describes in this documentary how both sides of his family lost members in the Holocaust, and how he implied that he was manipulated by this fact into joining the Israeli military after he grew up in Israel on stolen land. And then he decided to repent for this by making this documentary. And he says in this film that the Zionists have a weapon more powerful than the atomic bomb. That weapon is the Holocaust, which is to say the weaponization of tragedy, of human empathy to rationalize the atrocities that the Zionist state is now carrying out. And the imperialists all around, when it's come to Syria or China or other examples, it really countless examples, Yugoslavia, Soviet Russia, which is still regularly demonized. All of these places are applied with the same treatment, and the imperialists apply this treatment by fabricating fake genocides. They see that propaganda that the Zionists are able to use when it comes to the Holocaust is so effective that they're willing to fabricate accounts of genocide, and I think muddy the waters, and I think kind of exploit. They're kind of exploiting the Holocaust by weaponizing the capacity for people to feel empathy. And this is something that Norman Finkelstein talks about. He says that the US empire regularly weaponizes the Holocaust implicitly by convincing Americans that there are more Hitlers afoot in the world, and that the US just so happens to be opposed to all of them, that the US is constantly fighting against a new Hitler, whether that Hitler is Assad or Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un. These are pretty absurd narratives that the US empire puts out. But as Finkelstein describes, the US empire's propaganda gets people to somehow take it seriously every time. And this propaganda campaign has involved a really wide-ranging, complex series of psychological operations designed to weaponize people's empathy.
Yeah, the real Hitlers, the United States loves the best. Like the royalty, the royal family of Saudi Arabia, or the fascist dictatorships in certain countries in South America and Latin America, certain fascist regimes in Eastern Europe. Those are the people that the United States loves the best and treats the best. So it's pretty it's pretty Orwellian what they're doing. But there's still a lot of people who fall for it. A lot of people don't. A lot of people fully understand the fact that these Hitlers, so to speak, that the United States is against, just happen to be all the countries that refuse to kowtow to American imperialism, that insist that they're sovereign countries that have a right to decide for themselves. Next on the list, does repeatedly calling China a threat reify it? It's hard to deal with a criminal empire grounded in massive hypocrisy and incurable self-righteousness. This comes from the Greanville Post, November 7th, 2021. Let's see if I can find it here. Oh, here we are. Oh, wait. Here we go. Hegemony requires a coordinated mechanism to be in place for a belligerent entity to designate enemies, attack the leaders of the designated enemy, control narratives, i.e. lie, launch unprovoked attacks that murder a citizenry, destroy the economic basis of the named enemy, loot its resources, topple the enemy's leadership, and replace the leadership with one deemed acceptable to the attacking entity. Such a mechanism is multifaceted, and it requires a government, industry, military, and media that operates as a unit, along with other supporting facets. The United States is an entity that functions to support capitalism, imperialism, militarism, and situate itself as the global hegemon. The profit from violence is funneled to the American plutocratic class, in other words, the capitalist ruling class. One supporting facet of empire is the think tanks that are called upon to produce propaganda and disseminate disinformation through its mass media. In the US, one highly influential think tank is the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR. The Council on Foreign Relations is the world's most powerful private foreign policy think tank and membership organization. Dominated by Wall Street, it claims among its members a high percentage of past and present top US government officials, as well as corporate leaders and influential figures in the fields of education, media, law, and nonprofit work. Shoup argues, Shoup is one of the people that they interview in this. Shoup argues that CFR now operates in an era of neoliberal geopolitics, a worldwide paradigm that its members helped to establish and that reflects the interests of the US ruling capitalist class. If the US is going to wage serial wars, then it knows that it needs to stir up patriotic fervor to rally public support for the fighting forces. Therefore, it is critically important to control the narrative. In the case of the CFR, it has its own in-house media to assuage the message, the journal Foreign Affairs. In an article on November 2nd, Foreign Affairs continues to demonize China, but it also cautions against the US putting all its militaristic eggs in the China basket. It calls for a balancing of US foreign policy. After all, there are plenty of other designated enemies out there. In the view of its global economic weight, rapidly expanding military capabilities, illiberal values, and growing assertiveness, Beijing poses a formidable long-term threat to American security and freedom, according to Foreign Affairs. From the Chinese perspective, the same could be said for the US, but magnified. The US is still the largest economy in the by GNP metric. It has by far the largest military budget in the world, one that exceeds the spending of the next 11 countries. Moreover, the US has been deeply immersed in warring ever since its founding in 1776, a founding based on genocide of the original peoples. How is that for assertiveness? In contrast, China has not been at war for over 40 years, and this war lasted less than 4 weeks. So who poses a formidable long-term threat to whom? Is the Chinese Navy conducting so-called freedom so-called freedom of navigation exercises through waters off the coast of the US? Why this tendacious freedom of navigation descriptor? When has China ever stated that marine traffic was not permitted through the South China Sea? Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhou Lijian said, with the joint efforts of countries in the region, including China, passage through the South China Sea has been smooth and safe for a period of time, and not a single vessel has ever reported that its navigation is hindered or safety threatened in the South China Sea. The US allegation of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea threatened is simply untenable. So that's a bit of this article that we find in the Greanville Post on November 7th. And I urge you to read it more. We'll post a link to the article below this video. Rainer?
This overarching narrative that they're putting forth about China presenting an all-consuming threat, it really reminds me of what's being said about Nicaragua right now in U.S. headlines. Let's see what's Nicaragua's shift towards dictatorship is part of a Latin American backslide from the Wall Street Journal. And there is another headline I saw about Nicaragua's about Ortega, emboldened after stealing the election, is ready to tighten his grip in Nicaragua. The exact headline I'm thinking of has to do with how Ortega's victory is supposed to pose some kind of threat to Americans.
Yeah.
And it always portrays it as if threats to U.S. interests are synonymous with threats to the people within U.S. borders. But we should never accept this, because even though Americans are afforded relative privileges, even though our economy is tied in with exploitation of the global South, apparently pretty much every American uses some products that are built by global South slaves. We are victims of global capitalism as well. We should not be gaslighted into believing that that our interests are totally tied in with capitalism and imperialism just because we're forced to live in this system that foists this sick lifestyle on us, this lifestyle of benefiting partially from imperialism and slavery. The only way for us to have better lives, and for the people of the global South, obviously, to have better lives, is for us to facilitate the victory of socialism within both the exploited world and the core imperialist countries.
Right. Well put. Next on the list, Assange's persecution and the killing of hope throughout the West. Rainer Shea.
I've been studying Assange for many years now, and it's been so viscerally disturbing to learn about how this man has been not just tortured, but undergone character assassination, all as punishment for his exposing US war crimes. And in these last couple of years or so, as I've learned about China, the US hybrid asymmetrical war on China, I've gotten a deeper understanding of the geopolitical context that's been going on in the backdrop of the persecution of Assange, the media war on WikiLeaks, and so on. The situation is that for the last 15 years, since the US created AFRICOM in 2007 as a way to preemptively counter China's rise, the US has been more concerned than ever with concealing its war crimes. The whole nature of the US war within Africa throughout these last 15 years has been one of secrecy. The US has conducted a secret war in Africa that's not supposed to be portrayed by the media or by military officials or by politicians as the kind of war that the US carries out in Iraq or Afghanistan. It's been really trying to keep this reality of expanding global military operations hidden from public view. And when the Manning leaks allowed Assange's WikiLeaks to expose all of these war crimes, this really put in jeopardy Washington's mission to rule by secrecy. And the US has since been waging this war against Assange and dragging his name through the mud and trying to paint WikiLeaks as a Russian propaganda outlet as a way to preemptively defend against whatever dirt comes out about Washington's near future Cold War operations. Currently, Washington is still expanding its occupation of Africa via AFRICOM. It's currently expanding its occupation of the areas surrounding China. And all the time, the risk of war breaking out grows greater. All the time, the US ratchets up its color revolution tactics, its coup tactics in countries like Myanmar, and within the African countries that it's been fomenting coups within, all to counter China. And the list goes on of ways that Washington is waging war against essentially the entire world just to get back at China. But the only way that it can do these things is through secrecy, through not letting the public know about the heinous things it's doing throughout this new Cold War. And what Assange and Manning did still threatens them, even though it happened over a decade ago. So they're continuing to try to execute Assange in slow motion by seeking his extradition to the US.
Right. Well put. Okay, next on the list, Ortega Re-Elected. The people of Nicaragua vote for peace and prosperity and reject neoliberalism. In the early hours of Monday, Nicaragua's Supreme Electoral Council President Brenda Roca released the first official results of the presidential elections held on Sunday, after saying that the Nicaraguan people have been the protagonists of the country's historic civic celebration. She announced the results of the vote counted at the national and provincial levels, with 49.25% of the votes counted so far. President Daniel Ortega, who ran for re-election of the position, achieved 74.99% of the vote, 75% of the vote, basically. These results, and this was with a turnout of about around 65% of the voters, which is quite a bit better than you usually get in the United States. These results will allow the Sandinista National Liberation Front leader to exercise his 5th non-consecutive term from 2022 to 2027. So there you have it. Daniel Ortega, one of my favorites, back again for another term.
Right. The U.S. is trying to carry out a coup right now by painting the election as fraudulent. And it's the same thing that they did with Venezuela a couple years ago, as was the case then. And as will be the case now, it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
There are such clear limitations, I feel, that the U.S. keeps running up against, including within non-socialist countries like Belarus, which has a voting base that is simply not going to accept Washington's proxy candidate, fascist proxy candidate, despite the flaws within their current government. Even if they don't have the best, even if people don't have the best government, they're still not going to accept what Washington wants.
So you think that Belarus is non-socialist?
Not in the sense that it's not a Marxist-Leninist government, in the sense that it's not a capitalist, in the sense that it's still a capitalist state. There are only 5 Marxist-Leninist countries today.
I'm not so sure about that. I'm still on the fence about it. I'm still reading up on it. I'm reading a book right now specifically about the president of Belarus. And I mean, from what I can tell, Belarus is the only country out of all the republics of the Soviet Union. They were one of the republics, one of the major republics of the Soviet Union, the only country that kept its Soviet economic system. So therefore, and even today, something in the neighborhood of 75 to 80% of the economy is still government owned and run, I think, in the benefit of the people. I think that's part of the reason that the people were so adamantly opposed to the last attempt of the United States to carry out a color revolution last year in Belarus. So I don't know. I'm going to have to do more research on it, but from what I can tell, the Belarus is the one example of a Soviet republic that stayed Soviet, and therefore it is a Marxist-Leninist country with a workers' state. But that's, like I said, I'll at some point we'll do something on Belarus and get further with our understanding of that. Okay, next on the list, Nicaragua's coup failure reflects U.S. empire's weakening. Rainer Shea, more on Nicaragua.
These coup attempts keep failing, even when they've succeeded in recent years, like in Bolivia. The people within these countries have been able to fairly easily beat back these coups. Within just a year after the Bolivia coup, the Movement for Socialism Party was right back in power. And obviously that required a lot of sacrifices on the part of the people there, who had to protest against a brutal regime, brutal coup dictatorship. But the imperialists nonetheless lost. And this closing in of the forces of anti-imperialism obviously greatly worry the imperialists, because the less markets they can control, the less they can exploit, the more vulnerable the US empire is going to be when the dollar inevitably collapses, when the dollar loses its status as reserve currency. I've heard it argued that what it has been keeping the revolutionary struggle within the global South countries obstacle-filled and often discontinuous is the ongoing financial leverage of the US empire. And when this financial leverage is lost, there's going to be a great opening for lots more of these countries to join the pro-Chinese bloc, to break away from the dictates of Washington, to undergo socialist revolutions. And the US empire is perpetually trying to hold back this new wave of revolutions by fomenting instability, like it did last month in Bolivia when it got its armed right-wing proxies to take over a coca market in La Paz, displace the local coca growers, remove the indigenous flag, try to use that market's social and economic influence to start attacking the MAS government. So the imperialists can still do things like that, but it's in reaction to a larger process of imperial decline and the transition towards a multipolar world.
Well put. Well put. Yeah, these coup d'etats or attempted coup d'etats that we see in several parts of the world, Nicaragua just recently, the fact that the US is failing in most of them, even in the case of Bolivia, where they succeeded for about a year, finally the thing fell apart afterwards. It really is a sharp indication of the failure of the US empire, the American empire, in its collapse, basically. And we are seeing basically that it is in collapse. So that's it for us tonight. Thank you, Rainer, for everything you do. All of the articles, keep them coming. Very entertaining, and we learn a lot. So they're edutainment, I guess you'd say. And thank all of our viewers and listeners out there. Thanks for joining us tonight. And please return again next week when we'll have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. And with that, I'll bid you all a sweet adieu.